June 16th, 6 a.m. River Nile State, Eastern Sudan, a few dozen kilometers from the border with Egypt. The first explosion rings out over the Al-Ogaidat and Jabal al-Aqaidat gold mines. This is no random shelling. According to survivors, systematic aerial reconnaissance had been carried out over the mining sites in the week leading up to the strike. 4 hours before the attack, the Joint Forces unit guarding the mining site received orders to withdraw. The attack lasted from 6 in the morning until midday. Drones and heavy artillery targeted the mines, makeshift shelters, and the vehicles being used to evacuate the wounded. Those killed were not RSF fighters. They were civilian gold miners from the Bisharian and Ababda tribes, working in illegal gold mines. Thousands of people fled to the mountains and caves. Some of the dead remained in the mines. Rescue operations were impossible due to the ongoing fire. And then, silence. The Sudanese armed forces, Egypt's main ally in the war against the RSF, did not issue an official protest. They did not accuse Cairo directly. An advisor to the head of the Sovereign Council merely stated that direct channels of communication with Egypt remain open. To understand why bombs fell on these mountains on 16th of June, one must look beyond the map of the border. One must look at the reserves of the Central Bank of Egypt. Sudan is one of Africa's largest gold producers, but the country's mining sector does not rely on state-owned mines. It relies on artisanal mining, cooperatives of miners, which since the start of the civil war in April 2023 have grown to more than 2 million workers. This gold does not pass through Sudan's banking system. It is transported across the desert by lorry, straight to the black markets. And a significant proportion of it ends up in Egypt, a country with no major gold deposits of its own, but whose official gold reserves have risen markedly since the start of the Sudanese war, precisely because of this unregulated cross-border inflow. For Cairo, which has been grappling for months with the collapse of the pound and a shortage of hard currency, this gold is not merely a source of side income. It is one of the tools keeping liquidity afloat. But in the Al-Ansari and Al-Ogaidat area, Egypt faced another, more specific problem. Uncontrolled camps of gold panners had crept right up to the concession being developed by an Egyptian company in the disputed border territory. This gold was slipping past Egyptian control, straight into the hands of competing buyers. According to local sources, the conflict had been escalating for months. Egyptian border guards were burning the miners' equipment, setting fire to their makeshift shelters, and opening fire to drive workers away from territory that Cairo considers its own. On June 16th, this escalated into an airstrike. This was no mere border incident. It was a forceful crackdown on an independent supply chain that was preventing Cairo from monopolizing the flow of gold. Any sovereign state, as any textbook on international relations would teach, responds to an attack on its territory with a protest, or at the very least, with an official statement. Sudan did not do this. To understand why, one must look beyond diplomatic protocol. One must look at the front line against the RSF. What the SAF stands to lose by protesting: Egyptian intelligence on RSF movements, supplies of artillery and ammunition, electronic warfare systems against RSF drones, and cover for the eastern flank, whilst the main forces are fighting in Darfur and Kordofan. What does the SAF lose by remaining silent? Several dozen civilian miners killed, mining sites in disputed territory, which the state did not fully control anyway, and the appearance of sovereignty, but not sovereignty itself. This is not an abstract calculation. The withdrawal of the Joint Forces unit from the mining site 4 hours before the strike, according to eyewitnesses, points not merely to silence after the event, but to prior coordination. Someone in the command structure knew what was happening and decided not to intervene. If Egypt were to cut off the Sudanese army's supply line for a week, the government in Port Sudan would begin to lose territory faster than it could hold on to it. That said, the silence was not absolute. This is an important detail. Several Sudanese political parties publicly accused Egypt. The Republican Party called the strike treacherous Egyptian aggression, whilst an organization supporting Darfur victims placed full responsibility on the Egyptian army and appealed to the UN Security Council. But these were parties, not the government. The voice of discontent was channeled through the civil political arena, not through official channels that could have seriously damaged relations with Cairo. This is the true architecture of golden betrayal. The state technically allows discontent to exist, just not in its own name. The generals in Port Sudan made a calculation. The loss of a few mines and dozens of dead miners is a statistical error compared to the risk of the collapse of the entire eastern flank in the midst of an all-out civil war. They bought continued supplies at the price of publicly admitting that they do not control their own. This is modern geopolitics, without ideology and without speeches from the UN podium. Central bank reserves versus territorial integrity. Egypt needed to close the gold flow. Sudan needed weapons to avoid losing the war on 4 fronts simultaneously. The deal wasn't signed on paper. It was signed by a designated unit 4 hours before the strike, and followed by official silence.